Gaza City, Friday, August 9, 2004. The Al-Omari Mosque echoed with the voices of hundreds of worshippers during afternoon prayers, their unified chants rising as they knelt in organized rows, all facing toward Mecca. Present among the congregation was Salah Shehadeh, a high-ranking Hamas military commander who had orchestrated attacks resulting in the deaths of dozens of Israeli citizens. This was a man who strategically exploited the protected status of religious locations as a safeguard against Israeli strikes. What remained unknown to everyone gathered in that mosque was that a Mossad operative had infiltrated the space, posing as an ordinary worshipper and carrying a weapon so uniquely designed that it would cause death without producing any sound or leaving a visible injury, enabling the assassin to vanish into the crowd long before anyone discovered that the target had been neutralized. The mission to eliminate Salah Shehadeh within the walls of a mosque stood as one of the most daring and contentious assassinations ever carried out by Mossad. This operation demanded not just exceptional technical expertise, but also the readiness to execute a lethal strike inside a sacred space while prayers were being conducted. Such a decision flew in the face of cultural and religious conventions and carried the danger of sparking enormous political repercussions. Should Israeli involvement be exposed, or should the mission cause harm to innocent worshippers happen to be present when the assassination took place? The choice to move forward with this type of operation revealed Israeli intelligence's evaluation that Shehadeh constituted such a substantial threat that his elimination warranted both the hazards involved and the potential diplomatic fallout that would inevitably come afterward. Salah Shehadeh had entered the world in Gaza in 1961 and became a member of Hamas during the late 1982 throughout the First Intifada, climbing through the ranks of the organization's military branch to become one of its most effective and most dangerous leaders. Shehadeh had personally taken responsibility for building Hamas's military foundation in Gaza, bringing in new fighters and providing them with training, coordinating weapons, running smuggling networks, and designing attacks targeting both Israeli military personnel and civilians. By the time the early 2000s arrived, Israeli intelligence attributed to Shehadeh involvement in numerous attacks that had resulted in more than 100 Israeli deaths, positioning him as one of the top priority targets for Israeli counterterrorism efforts. Israeli military and intelligence agencies had made multiple attempts to eliminate Shehadeh using a variety of approaches, including aerial strikes, artillery fire, and commando raids. However, these efforts had been unsuccessful either because intelligence regarding his whereabouts proved inadequate or because Shehadeh's protective measures prevented Israeli operatives from getting to him before he relocated to different press and hideouts. Shehadeh had developed a reputation for constantly shifting his position, refusing to spend more than 1 or 2 consecutive nights in the same location, employing multiple bodyguards who carefully vetted visitors and secured perimeter defenses, and relying on couriers for communication instead of electronic channels that Israeli intelligence had the capability to monitor or trace. The difficulty of neutralizing Shehadeh was further intensified by his habit of utilizing civilian structures, including educational institutions, medical facilities, and mosques, as gathering points and temporary sanctuaries. He correctly calculated that Israeli military operations would hesitate to launch strikes on these locations due to the possibility of civilian deaths, and because of the political price that would come from attacking sites with cultural, religious significance. This strategy of employing human shields and using protected facilities for military objectives violated international humanitarian law, yet it proved to be an effective security approach from Hamas's standpoint because it took advantage of Israeli hesitation to create collateral damage, and because any Israeli attack that did produce civilian casualties would attract international criticism that Hamas could leverage for propaganda value. Israeli intelligence had spent years monitoring Shehadeh's activities and behavioral patterns, constructing a detailed profile of his routines, his connections, his protective protocols, and his psychological makeup. The intelligence showed that in spite of Shehadeh's cautious security habits, he adhered to certain routines that could potentially be used against him, including consistent attendance at Friday prayers at various mosques throughout Gaza City. Shehadeh rotated between different mosques each week to prevent establishing predictable routines. Nevertheless, he viewed attendance at Friday prayers as a religious duty that he refused to give up, even though participating required him to be in public spaces where he could potentially be exposed to Israeli operations. The concept of executing an assassination within a mosque during Friday prayers surfaced during planning meetings in mid-2004 when Mossad operational strategists were examining alternatives for eliminating Shehadeh following the failure of earlier attempts. The suggestion was at first rejected as excessively dangerous and politically delicate, but it gained renewed consideration when intelligence revealed that Shehadeh would be present at prayers at a particular mosque on a specified date, intelligence that offered a rare chance to know, with absolute certainty, where the target would be located at a precise moment in time. The operational framework demanded solving multiple technical and tactical challenges. To begin with, the assassination needed to be performed in a way that would not instantly notify the hundreds of other individuals in the mosque that an attack was underway, because any clear violence would cause mass panic and would probably result in the operative being captured or assaulted by worshippers before he had any opportunity to get away. Additionally, the elimination technique needed to be one that would not create obvious proof of Israeli participation, because an assassination taking place inside a mosque would already generate sufficient controversy without introducing evidence that it was an Israeli mission rather than the outcome of internal Hamas conflicts or other factors. Furthermore, the operative needed the ability to gain entry to the mosque without arousing suspicion from Hamas security staff who examined people coming into the mosque, and needed the capability to leave the mosque following the assassination without being recognized or stopped. The weapon chosen for this mission was a specialized instrument that Israeli intelligence technical divisions had created expressly for covert assassinations in situations where traditional firearms would be too conspicuous or too loud. The instrument was engineered to administer a fatal dose of a rapidly acting chemical substance through contact with skin, using a delivery system that looked like a common object that would not draw attention if someone happened to glance at it. The chemical substance was derived from neurotoxins that would trigger swift cardiac arrest and respiratory collapse, a death that would seem from external evaluation to be a heart attack or unexpected medical crisis rather than the clear result of a deliberate assault. The particular toxin chosen was an adapted version of a substance that had originally been created for medical studies, but that had been turned into a weapon by Israeli intelligence technical divisions for deployment in covert missions. The substance functioned by blocking certain receptors in the cardiac and respiratory networks, producing immediate disruption of heart function and breathing that would quickly advance to total system collapse. The benefit of this specific substance was that it left very few traces in the victim's body that would be discoverable through routine autopsy methods, and the traces that remained could possibly be confused with naturally present substances or with decomposition products of genuine medications, making it challenging for examiners to establish conclusively that death had been caused by intentional poisoning instead of by natural factors. The delivery instrument was hidden in what looked like a standard prayer bead bracelet, an object that would be entirely normal for a Muslim man to be wearing while praying, and that would not capture any attention from security staff or from fellow worshippers. The bracelet was built to be functionally the same as authentic prayer beads that were regularly used by observant Muslims, with the sole distinction being that one of the beads held a tiny container of the toxin and a micro-needle delivery mechanism that could be triggered by the person wearing it. The instrument was triggered by the operative pressing particular beads in a specific order, an activation that would be invisible to anyone watching, and that would ready the toxin for administration. The toxin would be administered through a needle so thin that it measured just 0.3 millimeters across, a needle that would emerge from the bracelet when the operative pressed it against the target's body with adequate force to permit penetration. The needle's construction was vital to the mission's success because it had to be long enough to go through clothing and into the target's skin where the toxin could access the bloodstream, yet short enough that it would not produce pain or noticeable sensation that would warn the target that he was under attack. The engineers responsible for designing the instrument had conducted extensive testing to establish the best needle length and delivery force, using animal test subjects and human volunteers to determine specifications that would guarantee dependable toxin administration while reducing the physical feeling that the target would encounter. The completed design employed a needle that was roughly 5 millimeters in length, and that was propelled by a small, compressed spring system that delivered uniform delivery force regardless of how hard the operative pushed the instrument against the target. The operative chosen for this assignment was a Mossad officer, whom we shall refer to as Yusef, a Palestinian Israeli who had been brought into Israeli intelligence operations and who had invested years constructing a cover identity as a Hamas supporter and as a committed Muslim. Yusef's heritage enabled him to operate within Palestinian society without immediately drawing suspicion, and his instruction in Israeli intelligence methods provided him the abilities required to carry out covert missions while preserving his cover. Yusef had executed prior operations in Gaza and throughout the West Bank, operations that had encompassed intelligence collection, recruitment of informants, and occasional direct action assignments against Hamas and Islamic Jihad targets. Yusef's recruitment into Mossad had taken place in the late 1992 when he was contacted by Israeli intelligence officers who recognized him as a potentially valuable resource based on his heritage, his family ties in Gaza, and his personal qualities that indicated he might be well suited for intelligence work. Yusef had been driven to collaborate with Israeli intelligence for complicated reasons that encompassed both ideological considerations and personal complaints, including disappointment with Hamas and with Palestinian Authority leadership that he viewed as corrupt and inefficient. His recruitment and instruction had required more than 2 years, during which he had been taught tradecraft abilities, including surveillance methods, communication protection, weapons operation, and the psychological conditioning required for executing operations where being discovered would lead to execution by Hamas security forces who would consider him a traitor deserving the most severe punishment. The groundwork for the mosque assassination demanded that Yusef establish a presence in Gaza City in the weeks preceding the operation, generating a believable explanation for his presence in the city and creating a pattern of attending Friday prayers at different mosques so that his attendance at the target mosque would not seem strange or questionable. Yusef crossed into Gaza through the Rafah border using identification papers that presented him as a trader from Hebron doing business in Gaza, a cover that was reinforced by genuine commercial transactions that Yusef performed to sustain his believability and to justify his presence in Gaza to anyone who might question his movements. The commercial disguise involved Yusef forming connections with Gaza merchants who traded in building materials and consumer products, connections that supplied both cover for his presence and chances to collect intelligence about economic circumstances and about Hamas operations in the commercial arena. Yusef attended Friday prayers at various mosques throughout July and the beginning of August, progressively moving closer to the Al-Omari Mosque, where intelligence suggested Shehadeh would be attending prayers on August 9th. The attendance at multiple mosques fulfilled several objectives, including permitting Yusef to watch security processes and to comprehend how worshippers navigated through the areas, establishing a pattern that would make his presence at Al-Omari Mosque seem routine rather than questionable, and giving Yusef the opportunity to rehearse the movements and timing that would be essential to get close to Shehadeh during prayers and to administer the toxin without drawing attention. Throughout these reconnaissance trips to mosques, Yusef gave special attention to how Hamas security staff examined worshippers entering mosques where senior Hamas officials were present, observing what actions or traits prompted extra inspection and what permitted people to move through security without being questioned. He noticed that security staff concentrated mainly on spotting individuals who seemed anxious or who were transporting items that could hide weapons, while giving less attention to individuals who seemed to be typical worshippers acquainted with mosque procedures and who brought only items that were standard for prayer, including prayer beads, compact Qurans, or prayer mats. Yusef also observed the physical arrangement of various mosques, including positions of exits, locations where security staff usually positioned themselves, and sections where congestion during prayers would offer concealment for close proximity to targets. The intelligence regarding Shehadeh's attendance at Al-Omari Mosque on August 9th originated from a human informant within Hamas, whom Mossad had been developing for multiple years, an informant who had access to Shehadeh's calendar and who had been supplying information about his whereabouts and operations. The informant, whose identity and rank within Hamas stayed classified, had been recruited through a mix of financial rewards and ideological motivation, having grown disappointed with Hamas leadership and having determined that cooperation with Israeli intelligence served Palestinian interests more effectively than continued armed struggle that was inflicting enormous hardship on regular Palestinians, while Hamas leaders maintained relatively per-band, comfortable existences and dispatched others to battle and perish in attacks that accomplished minimal strategic benefit. The informant's data about Shehadeh's mosque attendance was judged highly trustworthy based on earlier reporting that had proven correct. However, Mossad implemented extra safeguards to verify the information through additional informants and through technical monitoring that tracked communications between Hamas staff who were participating in Shehadeh's protection arrangements. The verification process confirmed that Shehadeh had in fact arranged time for attending prayers at Al-Omari Mosque on August 9th, and that his bodyguards had performed advanced surveillance of the mosque to evaluate security circumstances and to organize their protection protocols during the prayers. On the morning of August 9th, Yusef obtained final approval from Mossad headquarters to advance with the operation, approval that arrived following verification from the informant that Shehadeh had not altered his intentions and that he would be at the mosque for afternoon prayers. The approval was conveyed through encrypted communication that utilized a commercial cell phone network, with the message seeming to be a routine business text that would not draw attention from Palestinian security agencies that surveilled communications for suspicious material. The encoded message verified the operation was approved and supplied final intelligence updates regarding security circumstances at the mosque and regarding Shehadeh's projected arrival time. Yusef performed final preparations, including checking the delivery instrument to confirm it was operating correctly, going over the plan and backup options one last time, and performing surveillance of the mosque to watch security protocols and to determine best positions and paths for the assassination and getaway. The instrument testing required activating the mechanism to verify that the needle extended correctly and that the toxin container was correctly pressurized, testing that was performed in the seclusion of Yusef's safe house where he could operate without being watched. The testing verified that the instrument was operating as intended and that it was prepared for deployment in the operation. Yusef reached Al-Omari Mosque roughly 30 minutes before prayers were set to commence, timing that permitted him to enter with the early wave of worshippers, instead of showing up after prayers had already begun, when people arriving late might face more examination from security staff. Yusef moved through casual security inspection at the mosque entrance, where Hamas security staff watched people entering and sometimes questioned individuals who seemed suspicious. However, Yusef's look and behavior as a devout worshipper permitted him to enter without being questioned or searched. He brought only his prayer beads, which contained the weaponized delivery instrument, and a small Quran that he had bought in Gaza, and that displayed evidence of frequent use to reinforce his cover as a devoted Muslim. Within the mosque, Yusef situated himself in a spot that would enable him to watch Shehadeh when he showed up, while not being so near that Hamas security staff would observe Yusef giving unusual attention to their principal. The mosque became crowded quickly as afternoon prayer time drew near, with hundreds of worshippers organizing themselves in rows, facing the mihrab that showed the direction of Mecca. The packed circumstances were tactically beneficial for the operation because they would permit Yusef to get close to Shehadeh during the physical actions of prayer without such closeness seeming strange or questionable. Shehadeh showed up roughly 10 minutes before prayers started, coming through a side door that was less packed than the primary entrance, and that enabled him to enter with reduced exposure to public view. Shehadeh was escorted by 2 bodyguards who stationed themselves several meters distant from him, near enough to react if dangers appeared. yet distant enough that their protective function would not be quickly apparent to casual watchers. Shehadeh positioned himself in the third row, from the front of the prayer area, a spot that provided him good visibility of the imam, who would guide prayers while situating him in the center of the assembly, instead of at the boundaries where he could be more susceptible to attack from outside the mosque. When prayers started, Yusef shifted from his starting position toward the section where Shehadeh was positioned, moving during the standing segments of prayers, when worshippers adjusted positions and when movement through the prayer area would seem routine. Yusef positioned himself in the row immediately behind Shehadeh, a spot that would enable him to extend forward and establish contact with Shehadeh during the prostration segments of prayers, when worshippers would be bent forward with their heads close to the floor, and when physical contact between neighboring worshippers would be typical due to the packed circumstances. The assassination took place during the second prostration of the prayers, the instant when worshippers were bent forward with their foreheads pressed to the ground in a gesture of submission to God. Yusef extended forward as if modifying his position in the packed row, bringing his hand into contact with Shehadeh's lower back, where the toxin delivery instrument would pierce clothing and would inject the chemical substance directly into Shehadeh's body. The contact endured only a split second, sufficient time for the instrument to administer its payload, yet quick enough that Shehadeh would not register the contact as being anything uncommon in the setting of packed prayer circumstances. Yusef pulled his hand back right away and went back to prayer position, keeping the appearance of being concentrated on prayers instead of on any other action. The toxin started affecting Shehadeh within seconds, though the early effects were internal and would not be right away visible to watchers. The chemical substance disrupted Shehadeh's cardiac and respiratory networks, making his heart rhythm turn irregular and making his breathing turn difficult, effects that would quickly advance to total cardiac arrest and respiratory collapse. Shehadeh stayed in prostration position for multiple seconds longer than usual, a pause that his bodyguards could have observed if they had been monitoring him carefully, yet that was not right away apparent to other worshippers who were concentrated on their own prayers. When Shehadeh tried to stand from prostration to proceed with the following segment of prayers, he fell forward instead, his body becoming limp as the toxin's effects overpowered his capacity to keep consciousness or manage his movements. The collapse prompted instant concern from worshippers surrounding Shehadeh, who at first assumed he had lost consciousness or was having a medical crisis instead of recognizing that he was under attack. The bodyguards shifted rapidly toward Shehadeh, forcing through the rows of worshippers to get to him and to determine what was occurring. Other worshippers also shifted to help, generating confusion and crowding around Shehadeh's location that made it hard for anyone to grasp clearly what was taking place. Yusef stayed in his position for multiple seconds, keeping the appearance of being a concerned worshipper who was watching the medical crisis like everyone else near him. However, as the bodyguards got to Shehadeh and as more worshippers crowded around to observe what was occurring, Yusef started moving away from the direct area, drifting toward the mosque's exit among other worshippers who were also shifting away from the disturbance or who were trying to leave the mosque to call for medical help. The bodyguards tried to revive Shehadeh, examining his breathing and his pulse and trying to give first aid. Yet the toxin's effects were too far along for resuscitation to be successful. Within 2 minutes of the injection, Shehadeh was deceased, his heart having ceased and his respiratory network having collapsed totally. The bodyguards and other Hamas staff recognized that Shehadeh was not merely unconscious, yet was truly deceased, a recognition that prompted instant security action, including securing the mosque and trying to hold everyone present until investigators could figure out what had occurred. However, by the moment Hamas security staff acted to lock the mosque exits, Yusef had already departed the structure, leaving in the early moments of confusion before security lockdown protocols were put into effect. Yusef moved away from the mosque at regular speed, instead of running or otherwise behaving in ways that would draw attention, mixing into the crowds of people on the streets around the mosque and heading toward a safe house where he would stay concealed until extraction from Gaza could be organized. Within the mosque, Hamas security staff and Palestinian medical responders tried to figure out what had produced Shehadeh's death, inspecting his body for evidence of wounds or injuries that could suggest he had been shot or stabbed. The inspection discovered no clear evidence of violence, no bullet wounds or stab wounds or other injuries that would right away clarify his unexpected death. The tiny puncture mark where the toxin delivery instrument had pierced his skin was so small that it was not observed during early inspection. And even if it had been observed, it could have been dismissed as unimportant given that it was much too small to have produced death through traditional means. The lack of clear cause of death led Hamas at first to declare that Shehadeh had died of a heart attack or other natural medical crisis, a declaration that was politically awkward for Hamas because it indicated that their military commander had died from health issues instead of in battle or as a consequence of Israeli action. However, Hamas security staff stayed suspicious that Shehadeh's death could have been an assassination in spite of lack of clear proof, suspicion founded on the timing and setting of his death and on the reality that Israeli intelligence had been trying to eliminate Shehadeh for years and had powerful motivation to persist in those efforts. Hamas initiated extensive investigation into Shehadeh's death, performing thorough autopsy that discovered the small puncture wound and that found traces of chemical substances in his tissues that were incompatible with natural death. The investigation also required interrogating hundreds of worshippers who had been present at the mosque, trying to recognize anyone whose conduct had been questionable or who could not sufficiently clarify their presence at the prayers. The interrogations were performed forcefully, with Hamas security operations employing coercive approaches, including imprisonment, intimidation, and physical force to obtain information from individuals who were suspected of possessing knowledge about the assassination. The assassination of Salah Shehadeh within Al-Omari Mosque revealed the exceptional lengths Mossad would pursue to eliminate high-value targets, performing operations in settings and under circumstances that most intelligence agencies would regard as impossible or excessively dangerous. The operation succeeded through deployment of specialized assassination technology that created minimal proof through careful intelligence groundwork that recognized when and where the target would be exposed, and through operational tradecraft that enabled the assassin to get close to the target in packed circumstances and to get away before security reaction could be coordinated. The assassination removed one of Hamas's most skilled military commanders, yet generated controversy about Israeli readiness to perform lethal operations within religious locations during prayers. The operation brought up challenging questions about acceptable boundaries of counterterrorism operations, about whether religious locations should be regarded as forbidden zones for military action, even when they are being exploited by targets for safety, and about whether assassination approaches that create unclear proof serve genuine intelligence objectives or merely establish deniability that permits governments to escape responsibility for extrajudicial operations